The River of Giants by Benjamin Michael Tanner. La Nala, white-haired and buxom-naked, waded into the cool water of the river until she was submerged up to her waist. She peered down into the water at her reflection. She admired her silver mane, baby face, full lips, and all blue eyes. She cupped her hands and splashed water into her face before rubbing her eyes with her wet palms. She rubbed her arms, pits, and breasts with her wet hands before she closed her eyes, inhaled deeply, and completely submerged herself under the water's surface. On the bank of the river, La Nala's dinosaur companion, a female iguanodon with a hide as white as the hair of her rider, browsed on the low-growing ferns as she waited for La Nala to come back up out of the water. La Nala thrust herself back up out of the water, throwing her wet mane back. She sighed with relief as she reached over her shoulder, taking her wet hair in her palms and squeezing out the water. Unbeknownst to her or her iguanodon, two pairs of predatory eyes watched from a secluded spot in the trees above their heads. There, astride a pantherosaur, sat Smilodon, looking down from the canopy at the naked La Nala with longing eyes. However, Smilodon was not peeping upon the girl through perverted malice, but more by a sense of loving admiration. For Smilodon was in love with La Nala, and they were to be wed this day. Both Smilodon and La Nala were part of the proud and fearsome race of the Huns, who first came into being thousands of years ago, when the Saurus riders of the First Empire began crossbreeding with the indigenous Neanderthal people, resulting in a new hybrid species, still obtaining the characteristics of the Neanderthal: sloping forehead and larger muscle stature, but obtaining the taller height of the Saurus riders, as well as the ability of speaking in the Saurus tongue. The territory of Dinova, which the Hunnic tribes inhabited, was within a vast golden savanna to the north of the Conifer Barrens, not unlike the great fern sea to the south, called the Sun's Nest. And through this golden landscape ran a gargantuan river system that stretched all the way from the southern kingdom of Eurasia to the head of the Kaiju Bone Mountains. This river, the River of Giants, was decorated with lush marshland, teeming with many varieties of dinosaurs, from giant long-necked plant-eaters to great tyrannosaur-sized predators, whom all lived side by side. This marshy paradise was not only home to the dinosaurs, but also many types of aquatic species, from fish to snakes to turtles to giant crocodiles, so large that they could take down prey as large as a tyrannosaurus. Even the lizards here were giants, with some growing up to 40 feet long. The Huns have also made their homes within the swamplands, building crude hut villages both on land and over the surface of the river upon stilted dockways. Like La Nala, Smilodon's head was adorned by a mane of white hair, and his eyes were like those of a cat, blue with a glowing yellow. Smilodon's pantherosaur sat perched upon a strong tree limb, high enough for them not to be seen or heard. The wind was also blowing in their direction, so there was no risk of La Nala's iguanodon catching their scent. However, Sardka, the pantherosaur, caught the scent of an unseen and oncoming danger. He nor Smilodon could see ahead of them through the thick leaves, so they knew naught of what was coming. But below, towards the water, they could very well see a massive shape moving below the surface of the river, towards La Nala. She could not see it, and it was coming towards her. Below the trees, La Nala was completely oblivious to the anonymous shape just below the surface of the water until it was too late. Out of the river burst the form of a great white river monitor lizard. The massive reptile was a staggering 40 feet long, and its head was large enough that it could swallow poor La Nala whole. La Nala screamed, and she scrambled to get ashore where her iguanodon was waiting for her. The monitor lizard was closer to her, and it was about to snap its great toothly maw about La Nala when the force of the oncoming Smilodon and Sardka smashed into the reptile, causing it to crash back into the water with a tremendous splash. Soaked again, La Nala scurried ashore into the secure embrace of her iguanodon. They both watched in awe and horror as the monitor lizard shot up out of the water, with Smilodon clinging to the back of its skull and Sardka clutching its long, scaly throat in his powerful jaws. The reptile thrashed and shook about madly as it hissed and roared in a fury. It was trying to shake off its assailants, but to no avail. Sardka's great fangs sank deeper into the lizard's throat as he buried in his claws, while Smilodon unsheathed his dagger from the scabbard about his belt and began stabbing wildly into the back of the elongated reptilian skull. Blood splattered about Smilodon's face and chest from the gashing wounds he inflicted upon the monitor's scalp. All the while, the lizard was shaking more frantically now, as the crushing pressure of Sardka biting its throat had cut off his air supply, suffocating him. With his vision a piercing red, Smilodon continued slashing and stabbing into the lizard's head until the blade had completely demolished the back of the skull and stabbing into the exposed brain underneath. The great monitor lizard finally slumped down dead onto the riverbank, its snout inches away from La Nala's feet. Smilodon heaved heavily from being nearly exhausted from the adrenaline rush, but eventually calm was restored to him as he glanced over to his naked lover. La Nala broke into tears as she ran over to Smilodon, wrapping her arms about his neck and shoulders in a hug. Smilodon exhaled softly as he embraced her back, feeling the softness of her bare ivory flesh. La Nala pulled away from him, and her sapphire blue eyes stared into his tiger-like stare. La Nala spread her full plump lips into a warm smile as she pulled in for a kiss. Smilodon closed his eyes as he absorbed the tenderness of La Nala's kiss. He ran his fingers through her silver hair, and his other free hand reached down, cupping La Nala's bare bum. They continued their wooing for a few more moments before they finally pulled away. Smilodon spoke in a soft tone. La Nala, my maiden of moonlight, shall we return to the sanctum of our village together? It is almost dusk. Our wedding will begin soon. Just take me in your arms, and let us return then, she replied. Smilodon happily obliged, and took La Nala in his big great arms and strode away back to their village, with their dinosaur companions close behind him. The sun had completely gone from the sky, and the moon was now ascending. The wedding of Smilodon and La Nala was begun. As accustomed to primitive tribal peoples, a Hunnic wedding was a rowdy, provocative affair, with Hun men and women engaging in sexual play and naked girls dancing in rhythm to the primal beat of the ceremonial drums. The attendees were all nestled around a great bonfire in the center of a great glade, where the silver moon smiled down upon the Hunnic tribe. Smilodon and La Nala were seated beside one another on an altar, watching their primal kinsmen in their feral jamborees. The other tribes also attended, offering their blessings and wedding gifts to the bride and groom. Among these tribes were the clans of Saurismen known as Velocitartars, a raptorial race who shared the land equally with their Hunnic neighbors. Finally, after a great while of rowdy ruckus of the party, the tribal shaman, Atalo, old but broad-chested and big-bearded, rose from his seat beside the altar and raised his hand for silence, and the performance all around ceased. He then turned to Smilodon and La Nala and nodded his head. Bride and groom rose from the altar together and descended down the shallow steps. Smilodon and his bride halted in front of the blaze and turned to face each other. They stared into one another for a moment before La Nala turned away from Smilodon. Smilodon undid the laces of La Nala's silken gown that was tied behind her back, and he gently let it slide off of her body and to her feet, revealing her nude frame. Smilodon then slid off his girdle and loincloth and placed his hands upon La Nala's shoulders. Slowly they knelt down together. Now upon their knees, Smilodon placed his open palm upon La Nala's bare back and slowly pushed her upper torso downward, with his bride now suspending herself upon her hands. With his erection at length, Smilodon slowly thrust his way into La Nala. She groaned with pleasure and love and as Smilodon continued. All the while the ceremonial drums continued beating. La Nala began to pant and moan with sexual delight as her now husband had begun thrusting more intensely. Smilodon snorted through his nostrils as a cold sweat began dripping down his face. On and on the ordeal continued until finally Smilodon's seed had passed into the womb of his new wife. With the wedding complete, Smilodon and La Nala stood up together and embraced one another as they kissed. With the union between him and his wife, Smilodon had now taken over the role of chieftain of his tribe, and all cheered in celebration of the new couple and the child that would come to be.